This program was paid for by the friends and partners of Jeff Struecker Ministries. Welcome to Jeff Struecker Ministries. Jeff spent most of his adult life serving his country as an Army Ranger in countless combat missions. For his leadership and sacrifice, Jeff was inducted into the Army Ranger Hall of Fame. And then, God called Jeff to a new mission. Now, Jeff is passionately dedicated to guiding men and their families into a real, rugged, and relentless faith in King Jesus. And now, here's warrior and pastor, Jeff Struecker.
Preach in 3, 2, 1.
Daniel, Old Testament Daniel, if you remember the story from a child in school, he was a great man of God. He was a good man, an honorable man, but his political enemies were out to get him. So they worked behind the scenes to trap Daniel, and they knew they couldn't catch him doing anything wrong. So we're going to have to catch him in his faith. And Daniel went home that day. He opened his windows and he prayed, and his political enemies took him away in flex cuffs. They take him to the pit, and even the king of the land doesn't want to punish Daniel, but he foolishly made a decision, and now there's a law on the books that the king himself can't change, and the king has no choice but to throw Daniel into the pit with these hungry, angry lions. And when Daniel wakes up the next morning, he smells like lion, but there's no scratch anywhere on him. And the Bible wants to make sure that you didn't think that the lions had a tummy ache that night. So the very guys that worked behind the scenes to try to trap Daniel, try to trick Daniel, the king takes them and their families, throws them into the lion's pit. And the Bible says before they even hit the ground, the lions pounce on them and crush them. And the Bible leads you to this inevitable question: why does Daniel live in the pit, but his enemies die before they even hit the ground? What's different about Daniel than the rest of these guys in the pit? I'll give you the answer to the test question right here. Jesus goes with Daniel. Jesus goes with Joseph, and Jesus goes with you when your life is in the pit. And maybe some of you are just coming out of the pit right now. Maybe some of you feel like I just stepped into the pit and it is ugly right now. No one in this room wants to go into the pit. And the pit is never fun. It's never pleasant. And sometimes this pit is so painful that you're going to remember how bad it hurt for the rest of your life. But church, can I remind you of something? When Jesus goes with you into the pit, you will also tell that story for the rest of your life. And today in Genesis 39, Joseph is in the pit. Joseph actually got pulled out of the pit in Genesis 37 and sent away as a slave. And I want you to see what it looks like when you're in the pit and Jesus is in the pit with you. And so it's good for me to remind all of us, when life is throwing you some hardballs, when it doesn't feel fair right now, when you feel like Daniel, like Joseph, I didn't do anything wrong here, and my life is in the pit, I need to remind you that Jesus is still in charge. Come on, church. I need you to remember that Jesus is still in control, even when your life is in the pit, which means Jesus is in control over the pit. Because last week, we took this 1 week detour in the book of Genesis, and we saw that Judas is doing life without Jesus, and things are going great for Judas. Joseph, on the other hand, never done anything wrong. Not really. It's not really his fault. And Joseph is in the pit. And what we're struggling with the Bible today is, does Jesus love Judas more than he loves, or does Jesus love Judah more than he loves Joseph? Because here's how the story starts. Now, Joseph had been taken to Egypt, and an Egyptian named Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh and the captain of the guards, a pretty important dude, bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him there. And here's the phrase that you're going to hear multiple times today. The Lord was with Joseph. Will you just say that phrase out loud? The Lord was with Joseph while he was a slave in Egypt, and he became a successful man. serving in the household of his Egyptian master. When his master saw that the Lord was with him and that the Lord made everything that he did successful, Joseph found favor with his master, and he became his personal attendant. Joseph has the Midas touch, and because the Lord is with him, everything that Joseph does turns to gold. And Potiphar can see it. So Potiphar also put him in charge of his household and placed all that he owns under his authority. And from that time that he put him in charge of his household and all that he owned, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house because of Joseph. The Lord's blessing was on all that he owned in his house and in his fields, and he left all that he owned under Joseph's authority. He did not concern himself with anything except the food that he ate. This is how powerful it was, how obvious it was that the Lord was with Joseph. Everybody could see it. Even this pagan Egyptian can see that the Lord is with this guy. Now, for hundreds of years, pastors have covered up a great sin using this verse from the Bible. There have been pastors for hundreds of years that have argued that God really doesn't have a problem with slavery because look, it's right here in the Bible in front of you. And I wish some of those men were standing in front of me right now because they could not be more wrong. In fact, it was this very verse right here that caused a lot of Baptist pastors to sanction putting Africans in chains, taking them away from their continent. I can take you to the exact spot right next to the Chattahoochee River, hidden by the overgrowth, where a man could purchase another man because this is as far as the slave ship could make it up the river before it hit the rocks. So they took the slaves off and they put them on the auction block. And I better stop talking about this because I'm getting real angry right now. There is absolutely no room in Christianity. I don't even know you can call yourself a Christian if you believe that one person can purchase another human soul. Only the blood of Jesus is powerful and wealthy enough to purchase a human soul. One of the things that I want us to keep in mind today, because the Bible makes this clear over and over again, Joseph would be dead right now if God didn't step in. And God can see part of the picture that you and I can't see. Sometimes God steps in and spares us from things that we will never know this side of heaven. Sometimes he spares us from what could have been. And yeah, what is happening right now is no fun, but what could have been is far worse. And what we need to do is just remember, God knows what you and I don't know. He knows what might have been. And what might have been could have been far worse. And the Bible wants us to know that God is with Joseph. And it is so obvious that God is with Joseph that everybody can see it. And sometimes you're going to find yourself in circumstances of life like Joseph. I didn't do anything to deserve this, and I don't wish this on my worst enemy. But that does not mean that God does not care. It does not mean that God does not know. I started this sermon today with a description of Daniel because Daniel is a good man that did nothing wrong. Joseph did very little wrong and does not deserve to be where he is right now. And if this can happen to Daniel, if this can happen to Joseph, it can definitely happen to you. Guys, they're not the only ones that end up in a pit. And then it gets worse because now there's temptation waiting for Joseph in the pit. And I had to look this word up this week. Joseph is a himbo with the letter H. This word apparently stands for a guy who is hot stuff, but he's kind of ignorant, a little bit clueless, like a bimbo is. And that's where Joseph is right now. And maybe he doesn't see the temptation that's waiting for him. But the second half of verse 7 makes it very clear. Joseph is being ambushed. And here it comes. Verse 7. Now Joseph was well built and handsome. And after some time, his master's wife looked longingly at Joseph and said, "Sleep with me." Now, the English language doesn't give you the full weight of this temptation. In the original language, she's actually only using 2 Old Testament Hebrew words. They're basically the words that say, "I'm yours." She is throwing herself at Joseph. And apparently, this doesn't happen once. It happens repeatedly. "Sleep with me," she said to Joseph, but he refused. And listen to his reply. "Look," he said, "Look," he said to his master's wife, "with me here, my master doesn't concern himself with anything in his house, and he has put all that he owns under my authority." Basically, I would ruin my master's house. I would ruin my honor. I would ruin my reputation if I did what you're tempting me to do. No one in his house is greater than I am. He has withheld nothing from me except you, because you're his wife. So how could I do this immense evil? I really think he's using this language. How could I sin against God and do something so wicked? And although she spoke to Joseph, here it is, day after day, he refused to go to bed with her. The Apostle Paul reminds us, 1 Corinthians chapter 6, that all of the other sins that you and I will commit, those sins are outside the body. But a sexual sin, that is a sin against the body. It's a sin inside the body as well as outside the body. And there are 2 chapters in the book of Proverbs, chapter 6 and 7, that say this about adultery. If you do this, it's going to lead to your own self-destruction. Proverbs says that you will be wounding yourself. You will disgrace yourself publicly. And in the end, chapter 7 of Proverbs says it will ultimately cost you your life. And maybe Joseph is wise enough to realize that. But I'm certain Joseph has to wrestle with this temptation. He has to ask himself, how am I supposed to say no to this? When she says, "Listen, my husband's doing me wrong and he's beating me and cheating me and mistreating me and now he's up and gone." And Joseph is going to ask himself, how on earth am I supposed to say no to this? This is like a meth addict working as a janitor in a college chemistry lab. Joseph is surrounded every day, all day long, with temptation. And Joseph is able to do, quite frankly, what nobody else in the Bible except for Jesus is able to do. Because Hebrews reminds us Jesus is tempted even sexually. Because he's tempted in every way a human will ever be tempted. Yet Jesus is without sin. The pit can always get deeper. And for Joseph, it does get deeper. It now goes from bad to worse. It's already really ugly for Joseph, and now it gets worse. You ready for the good news? That even when it gets deeper, Jesus is still with you. Listen to what the Bible says next, starting in verse 11. Now one day, Joseph walked into an ambush and he didn't even see it coming. Now one day he went into the household to do his work, but none of the household servants were there. This should get Joseph's attention. And she, Potiphar's wife, grabbed Joseph's garments and she said to him, "Sleep with me." Basically, it's the perfect time. Here I am, let's go. But leaving his garment in her hand, he escaped and ran outside. And when she saw that he had left his garment with her and ran outside, she called her household servants. "Look," she said to him, "my husband brought a Hebrew man to make fools of us. He came to me so that he could sleep with me. And I screamed as loud as I could. And when he heard me screaming for help, he left his garment beside me and ran outside." So she put Joseph's garment beside her until her master came home. Pause for just a second. Joseph is probably very much like Dobby in Harry Potter. He only has one piece of clothes, which means he ran outside naked and she locked the door behind him. Now you're a Hebrew slave, and the door is locked behind you, and you're standing outside naked, and his wife is saying, "This man tried to molest me. How do you think this is going to go for you? How do you think this is about to go for Joseph?" And just to make sure that she reminds Potiphar of Joseph's stature in life, listen to her language. Then she told her husband the same story. This Hebrew slave, he was already nothing. His life was of no value. Now he's less than nothing. His life is less than no value. This Hebrew slave that you brought to us came to make a fool of me. But when I screamed for help, he left his garment beside me and he ran outside. And when his master heard the story, his wife told him, "These are the things your slave did to me." He was furious and had Joseph thrown into prison, where the king's prisoners were confined. So Joseph is there in prison. This is Pharaoh's dungeon. It's his dungeon for political prisoners, meaning this is the worst place in Egypt to be. Joseph just went from bad to worse here, and he did absolutely nothing wrong. The worst part about this is that Joseph honored God, and it got worse. Now, Joseph's in an ambush. He didn't see this ambush coming. I take it from somebody who's been in a real ambush. Most of the people are not going to survive an ambush, but even if you do survive, it's going to be really, really ugly. And Joseph gets ambushed. He doesn't see it coming, and now he's outside, and he looks guilty. And when Potiphar comes home, his wife lays this story out like, your servant was trying to have his way with me. And I think the Bible is going to remind us there are some moments in life where the temptation is so powerful, you have one choice left. What is it, church? Run. In fact, the word that the Bible uses here, Joseph ran away, it becomes a Hebrew phrase. He ran like a leopard. And Joseph runs outside, and now he just simply looks guilty. And the Bible is reminding us, don't play games with temptation. Run away from it. Run like a leopard away from it, like a big cat that's scared. Don't flirt with temptation, which means pay very serious attention to it. You want to know how serious you should be with temptation? Listen to the words of Jesus, Matthew chapter 5. If anyone's eye causes you to sin, rip it out. If your hand causes you to sin, cut it off. This is violent language that Jesus is using about temptation. What Jesus is saying is, if your internet causes you to sin, cut it off. If that romance novel that you're reading continually leads you to sin, if flirting with that guy at the coffee shop, if your cell phone leads you into sin, then throw it in the garbage. It's better to throw your cell phone into garbage than to be destroyed by the temptation, is the language of Jesus. And can I remind you of something that the Bible is making sure that we understand today? It is better to be in Pharaoh's dungeon with Jesus than to be where Judah is right now without him. I think you might have missed that, so I'm going to make sure you hear it again. You are better off in the pit with Jesus than where your neighbor is right now with everything in life going right for them without Jesus, because in the end, Jesus is still in control. And maybe for Joseph, it doesn't feel like that, but the Bible doesn't let us miss the fact that even while Joseph is in prison, God is still with him. And even when you're in the pit, God is with you. You see, what I'm trying to do with this sermon is to help you hang on. Because there are some times that life gets hard. And those moments when it gets really, really hard, it's easy to think, you know what? There's no hope. And I want to make sure that you recognize, no matter how bad it gets, for God's children, he still loves you. He hasn't forgot about you. God will not only take care of you, but God will actually go with you into that pit. I want to remind us of this promise that Jesus is the King of the universe, which means Jesus is the only one that has the rope that can get you out of the pit. And look at what happens to Joseph when he's in prison. But the Lord was with Joseph. We've heard it many times today. Even in Pharaoh's dungeon, the Lord was with Joseph and extended kindness to him. And you're saying, hold on, Jeff. Nothing about this seems like God is being kind to him. In fact, if God was really kind to Joseph, he wouldn't even be a slave, let alone in prison right now. And most of us tend to think, God, if you're kind to me, that means everything in life is going good for me. That is not what the Bible promises. In fact, that is not what we see in some of the great men and women of faith throughout the Bible. Even though they did nothing wrong, because they live in this sin-broken world, life gets really, really ugly for them. And God still loves them. That word, kindness, hang on to it. I am convinced it is the most important word in the entire Bible. The Lord extended kindness to Joseph. He granted him favor with the prison warden. And the warden put all of the prisoners who were in the prison under Joseph's authority, because just like Potiphar, this prison warden can see the same thing. He was responsible for everything that was done there. The warden didn't bother with anything under Joseph's authority because the Lord was with him. And the Lord made everything that Joseph did successful. Potiphar could see that the Lord is with him. The prison warden can see that the Lord is with Joseph, but I'm wondering if Joseph can see that the Lord is with him right now. See, your translation of the Bible, depending on what translation you're using, it struggles to translate this word kindness. In fact, in a lot of English translations, there is no clear word-for-word translation from the Hebrew language to the English language. I don't know how this shows up in Afrikaans or in Tagalog, but in the Hebrew or in the English language, we have to use a phrase to describe this because we're describing something that is supernatural and not found here on earth. It's the word he said, or it's often shows up in the Psalms and in the poetry of the Bible as God's chesed. It's his everlasting love. It's God's loyal love. It's God's loving kindness. Depending on your translation of the Bible, there's no one word in our language to describe what the Bible is saying here. So it uses a phrase that God extended his loving kindness to Joseph even when he was in the prison. And by the way, when this word is used, the Bible wants to make sure that you understand it's not because of anything that you did. It's not because of anything that Joseph did. In fact, this word almost never means that you're lovable or that you're lovely. This word really means that despite what you've done, God has chosen to show his love to you, his loving kindness to you. God has poured his favor out on Joseph, even when he is a slave in Potiphar's house, even when he is in prison in Pharaoh's dungeon. God still hasn't forgot about Joseph. And I need you to remember that God shows his loving kindness to his children, even when life hurts. That even though you might be in the pit right now, and even though it feels like God doesn't know or God doesn't care, it doesn't mean that he's forgotten about you. In fact, the best way for us to hear this word is to remember what Romans chapter 5 tells us. That God demonstrates his loving kindness, his loyal love, his favor on us in this way. That while we were still right in the middle of our sins, God loved us and he sent his son Jesus to die for us. And I've been using this phrase over and over again, that Jesus goes into the pit with you. Because Jesus' incarnation is proof of God's love. See, the fact that Jesus would be willing to leave heaven and come dwell on this pit that we call planet Earth is proof of God's love. You want to know when life is going really bad? You want to know when circumstances hurt really bad right now? You want to know when things are going wrong and you didn't even do anything wrong? God, do you love me? Well, Romans chapter 5, verse 8 says this. You just look back at the cross of Jesus Christ. If you want to know, does God love you? Go look at the pit that Jesus was willing to go into for you. Not just with you as he walked here on this earth with his own creation, as he suffered and went through hardships just like you and I do. He didn't have to do that. He didn't have to give up his throne and glory, but he was willing to go into this pit with us. And then on the cross, he was willing to do something for us that we couldn't do for ourselves. He was willing to take the penalty of death off of our shoulders and literally go into a borrowed tomb that you and I deserve for us to be made right with God. Would you bow your heads? Would you let me pray for us?
Thank you for watching today's broadcast from Jeff Struecker. To learn more about Jeff and his mission to guide men and their families into a real, rugged, and relentless faith in King Jesus, go to jeffstruecker.com.